Hello everyone, this is Kat, and welcome to Tank Talk, where I'll be talking about tanks, tank development history of various nations during mainly World War II, different time periods there, and I'll be using the game War Thunder here to give you some visualizations on the vehicles I'll be talking on. Today, I'll be talking about the United States of American, their tanks, their development of armored vehicles in general, at the early stage of World War II and also slightly before that in the 1930s. So during the 1930s, even before the 1920s, of course, the USA had the Great Depression, and after the recent war before that, World War One, people weren't really anticipating a new war just yet. Of course, they were developing tanks, and the tanks the United States were developing are mostly things like this M2A2. Very small, light tank armed with only a couple of machine guns. One thing that I will point out, which is going to be a trend with most tanks in the United States development cycle here, they're really fond of radial engines, which, while they were powerful, are very tall, which led to a lot of tall tanks in their designs. But when World War II approached, the United States quickly realized that a tank only armed with machine guns was not gonna be enough to defeat armor of mainly the German tanks that they were looking at. So they took this hole and put a large circle in the center to fit a new turret, which is where the M2A4 came from, armed with a 37mm gun and even more machine guns. This is another trend which you're going to see in the early stages of American tank design. They were really loving their machine guns, and that's pretty much a mainstay from the World War One, where most tanks were still armed with machine guns because they were also just really effective, and that kind of slowed down the further down the line. But even this was not really good enough, mainly because of the armor. It's only 25 millimeters of armor, and even this 37 millimeter tank gun, which actually a lot of people criticize on for the Americans using the 37 millimeter for so long, but it's actually a very surprising effective gun. In the game here, this one model can penetrate up to 75 millimeters of armor, and there are even models that can penetrate up to around 90 to 100 millimeters, which is more than enough to defeat any German tank up to 500 meters range, except for the Panther and Tiger tanks, which were not even like designed yet when this thing was built. So even then, this model wasn't quite good enough, mostly still to the armor, and quickly went on to the M3 Stuart. And the M3 Stuart went on was the mainstay for the reconnaissance branch of the armored tank divisions, and that was basically because it was a really small tank that could get by pretty much anywhere. Later on, there were some minor changes that led to the M3A1 Stuart, and roughly around 1942 1943, the M5 Stuart was introduced with a new hull and engine that drastically increases mobility and armor protection. The turret was redesigned going from rivets to welds, which was also a great improvement, because that's one thing I guess some people might not realize, but rivets are actually one of the weakest ways of constructing a tank, because if any large explosive shell would even hit nearby, there was a high likelihood of the rivets getting disconnected, and if that happened to be on the inside half of the tank, those rivets would fly around everywhere, harming the crew inside, which were all pretty damn cramped. So if one would get hurt, generally the other ones would get hurt as well. And of course, rivets disconnecting would also lead to tank just falling apart entirely. That's a great problem. And generally, like this kind of design still is very much visible in the M2, supposed medium tank, which exists for a very short time but never really got anywhere. Still rivets everywhere. And again, machine guns everywhere. There are two fully fixed machine guns in the front that can only shoot wherever the hurl is facing. They cannot be aimed up, down, left, or right. Not at all. There are four more turrets in the sponsons. Two forward, two back. And there's a machine gun next to the 37mm gun. Again, we already talked about that 37mm gun. And we got two more machine guns on the roof, which can, when disconnect here, it has a rotational joint, which allows it to fire kind of like upwards-ish, but still not very much. And I assume they will be used for anti-air role, but um, they're really, yeah, not effective. And over time, they did get rid of a lot of those machine guns. Now, onto the larger guns of early designs on the American tanks. First thing, they had this pretty effective 75 millimeter gun, but it was much larger than a 37 millimeter gun. It wouldn't fit in any existing tank, and it didn't have any tank hull either that could fit a larger turret. So at first they would put it on half tracks, much like this M3 gun motor carriage. And that's another thing you will see in American tank design, that they like to put things on half tracks. Half tracks are a design that is from World War II. A lot of nations use half tracks, but it ended up really not going anywhere because, well, it kind of slightly maintained the off-road capability of a tank. It wasn't enough to warrant the loss in speed from moving from four wheels to two wheels and two tracks. And they moved on to the M3 Lee for their 75 millimeter cannon needs. The 75 millimeter cannon mainly was actually for shooting high explosive shells, because the 37 millimeter gun didn't have the caliber large enough to really have any bunker destroying capabilities with high explosive. The 75 millimeter gun did have armor piercing as well, but the reason why they put the 37 millimeter gun in here was just because it was so darn effective still. And you can still see machine guns still littered around everywhere. We got two in the front, fully fixed, one in the turret, and one in the commander's cupola, which led to this really, really tall tank as well. Because of course you have the pretty tall hull to fit the gun and the radial engine, of course, a pretty tall turret, and then an even tall cupola on top of that, which was another one of the big complaints with the M3 Elite. Was just, it was way too tall. The rivets were also again a problem, making the tank fall apart. And yeah, people just didn't realize. The often just don't realize that going from this to something like the M4 Sherman really was a big step, and they needed time for that. But at the same time, they also needed to have the 75 millimeter gun on a tank. The Americans very well knew that the M3 Lee was a bad tank, and they replaced it as soon as they could. But they needed that gun now, so it really was a stopgap measure there. And that's actually where you see the most of the early war designs end. The rivets and the machine gun spam all again goes away when you start seeing the Shermans come around. And another thing I kind of have to explain with the tanks of the United States is their design philosophy. So when the war started out and tanks had to be mass produced, the government kind of like went around the country and when looking for different kind of factories. For example, you would have a factory that would build engines. And basically what they said is, okay, the engines you now make, you were making for cars in general, or you're now going to make engines for tanks. And they would do that with a lot of different things. Weapon manufacturers would start creating cannons, etc., etc. And then they would build one big factory where all the different manufactured parts would be sent to, and that's where the tanks would be actually like assembled. That way, there was a lot of capitalism going on again, because if you could produce more parts, you would get more money, and that's basically how the United States did it economically. Another big thing to point out is that all these tanks had to be shipped overseas across the Atlantic Ocean. And because they had to be shipped so far, not only did you have weight limits, you also had to make sure everything was very, very reliable. And that's a complaint mainly for the later in the war on USA tank design, is that they had better tanks than they were sending overseas, but those tanks weren't tested enough, and the army also just was, our stuff is good enough. We don't want to retrain our crew on a new tank, so we're gonna keep using what we have right now. And that's why a lot of designs, while they were already like existent, and could improve the status quo during World War II, they weren't sent over. And that is very much shown in the supply depots on the western side of the conflict. You had basically entire tanks lying there except for the hull. Because if you had any broke down part, like any part that would be broken down, you could easily just go to the supply depot, get a new part, and repair the tank only a few hours. And because of the large amount of reliability tests and that combined, if you had 100 tanks in your tank group, and you would say, I'm going to attack a position tomorrow, about 95 to 100 tanks in your lineup would actually roll up and enter the battle. And I'm going to use that statistic over time with the other factions as well. And you're going to see that that's actually one of the highest numbers around, with Germany actually being one of the worst. But that's going to be a story for another time. Lastly, one thing I do have to add, one thing you will notice with all the tanks you hear is that they have really small tracks. And now we know that we need larger tracks to reduce ground pressure, but back then, the Americans thought less track equals less weight. And while it holds true to some point, they did notice their flaws and they would issue tank track extenders where you could attach to the tracks would make them more wide on this side. And even on the other side, with a lengthened driving axle for the wheels, so they would be further away from the center hull. That's really all there is to early war American tanks. It's a bit of a ramble as always. I do not really script my videos as always, so if I did miss anything, please point out that in the comments down below. Furthermore, I hope you guys all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys all on the next one.